Curtis, go for it.
Hi, Curtis.
Hey, hello. Was there anything more you had to say about Arnold Guyot?
No, actually, I'm just reading the chat now. I didn't see the chat this whole time, but I see that you wrote that Henry C. Carey read Guyot. So please, if you have anything more to share, my only knowledge of him is from this little bit of study that I did of him in relation to his correspondence with Dana.
Well, I have his book, The Earth and Man. I was gonna, is there any way I can read something or?
Please do.
Okay, so this is from The Earth and Man, right? And he says, the animal does not degenerate because the form of his existence is necessary. He is not required to add anything, but man, who should grow in perfection by the constant exercise of higher faculties of his nature, by struggling against the evil inclinations of a perverted will, man descends evermore and proceeds from fall to fall if he neglects those divine gifts and abandons himself to the lower instincts of his animal nature.
Yeah. Very much in line with what was said, and that's, I think, what Huxley and the Darwin Project was trying to do, is to debase the view of man in that way.
Yeah. And I have another question. The quote by Jonathan Winthrop in which he's quoting Genesis, where is that from?
That is from it's called In Defense of the New England Plantation, or just give me a second, I'll get you the title. It's Reasons to be Considered Justifying the Plantation of New England.
Is that in a book, or did you get it online? Where did you get it from?
I first encountered it in Graham Lowry's book, and you definitely can find it online, though. Yes, you can find the whole thing online. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I got Graham's book. I look for it. Yeah, that was pretty interesting because I've only heard the only economist that I've heard talk about that was Ezra Seaman and Henry Carey. And of course, Lynn does it too, but the first ones to do it was Ezra Seaman and Henry Carey. And Ezra Seaman went more into detail about the subduing part of nature. And another guy, John Bowes, who wrote Sophisms of Free Trade, he says before man can replenish, he has to learn how to subdue. So I just find that interesting.
Yeah, no, that's a profound thought. It's absolutely true. Yeah, before man can replenish, he has to subdue, because I mean, now, like, the environmentalist view is the subduing of nature is an evil, but really it's the predicate upon which all of human progress has come. And it's not necessarily a negative thing. It's not about, the rape of nature. It can be about the protection and the improvement of nature as well. But the subduing of nature through the discovery of new physical principles that we can then apply is crucial.
You have a statement from Bob.
Oh, I just wanted to say one before Bob goes, Curtis. There was a guy in the LaRouche movement, Michael Kirsch, who wrote a book on the problems of the credit supply. And the beginning of the book has a number of really great quotes from John Winthrop and a number of other people who were his allies in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Mm-hmm. And I think you'd really enjoy it.
Cool.
Hey, Bob.
Hi. Boy, I have 500,000 different things, but just limit, because my battery, unfortunately, the battery on this iPad, I thought it was hooked up, but it's not. Anyway, so if I go blank, forgive me.
Okay.
But anyhow, a couple of things on this, just the last few things when you were talking about energy density. One thing that made me think of, for example, when you're talking about the electricity from nuclear as opposed to coal or whatever, and the idea of useful energy, that brings to mind actual, you need to couple that with the transmission, which is the transportation. So that superconductivity in that regard is immensely important in terms of power grids and so forth. Because we'll be able to get plenty of energy density out of the source. We've got to get the throughput also. And if we lose all that power in transmission lines, as you see in what's happened in Texas right now, that's why it's so important for the area of the research into superconductivity. That's just one point. Another thing that came to mind is one of the last things you were wrapping up on this idea of the relative population density. As you go to more space-based technologies, it's always good to look at breakthroughs that are going to happen as a result of space. And when we go to space, we're going to be growing more and more food, really, without soil. Hydroponics, for example, you can see immediately how the richness of the land and so forth is not going to become an issue if we can replicate in space via hydroponics and that's that form of agriculture. And why right there, it's a good example of how our emergence off the planet, the noosphere really is no different than the space colonization age. That it's a good way to put those two things together. So anyhow, that was a couple things.
So there's a lot to unpack there. I'm going to deal with the transmission lines and superconductors after, but I'll say, first of all, it sort of deals with what Vernadsky was saying on humanity becoming an autotroph, that as you move out into space, humanity is going to need to become an autotroph. Now, can you argue that through hydroponics or other technology, he's not technically an autotroph still, because you're still growing plants, even though it's, in a different sort of synthetic way. So he's not a pure autotroph. But again, hydroponics requires a lot more energy. For example, like to run all the pumps and everything than just simply watering soil. So it again shows, the need for nuclear power in space, a high energy flux density in space, if we're to become a spacefaring society. And I'll just say about the superconductors. Superconductors, yeah, we need them. There's no question. They'll make a whole bunch of things, from like maglev to fusion, instantly viable. The transmission lines, like copper, is pretty good. Like being an electrical engineer, I'll say like the losses on transmission lines are about 6-7%. So like it's not great, but we can manage. And what happened in Texas, a lot of what happened in Texas wasn't to do with the transmission lines per se, more to do with winterization of meters and control systems that Texas, what's their regulatory is called ERCOT, I think. And they've known for years that they were poorly winterized, and that they could have things like, they had, like, first of all, their wind and solar stopped working. Obviously, the solar panels are covered in snow. If you go and look at the daily output graphs, the solar and wind output just falls off a cliff when the storm hit. But even natural gas and nuclear went down. Actually, nuclear was the backbone in Texas for such an oil-rich place. But you even had failures. So you had failures in the natural gas and the oil plants, the coal plants, and the nuclear plants, because meters and things that are used in the control systems were freezing and failing because they had bought cheap ones. Maybe you can excuse it because it's Texas, and really, like, how much winter do they get? And I'm not an expert on this. I haven't studied this a lot, but from what I was reading, there are reports from Texas studying this, saying, hey, this could happen because we haven't properly winterized. So yeah, that's what I'll say about Texas. It wasn't so much the transmission lines, but I do agree with you definitely that room temperature or high temperature superconductors are absolutely crucial, and we should, along with fusion, have a crash program on developing them.
Cynthia, I apologize. I think I cut you off when you were about to bring up somebody's statement or a thought earlier on. Did you want to raise that?
Well, Jerry can ask his question, and what I'll do is I'll look at it and I'll summarize it because it's a long comment by someone. So
Okay.
Jerry, you go forward.
Hi, Jerry,
Oh, how you doing, Sam?
my fellow
I
Ontarian.
I just had a question on energy sources. A couple of weeks ago when Quadamak did his class and he had that chart of energy per population, just to give us an idea of the enormous demand there is for energy if we wanted to raise everyone's living standards to what we had. But after that, Madeline and I were talking, and she brought up this idea that if you take any energy source, whether it's a coal plant or a nuclear plant or a windmill or whatever, how long does it take for that plant to produce enough energy to build another one just like it? And because I don't think a windmill or solar panels could ever produce enough energy to build another one. So it's kind of like a dead end. We're wasting our energy building these things when they can't even reproduce themselves. Are you familiar with that idea? How long it takes to produce enough energy to produce another one?
I don't know for solar panels, because solar panels are a very energy intensive process. And I haven't looked at the numbers, but I did many years ago look it up for wind turbines. And the estimate is in 9 or 10 months of a wind turbine operation at its average capacity factor, which is typically around 30%. Like capacity factor means how much percent of the time is it producing its rated energy output. And windmills, it tends to be about 30%. So it's very unreliable energy. We know this about renewables. You never know when they're going to be producing energy. But if you average it out, given their average capacity factor, the amount of time for a windmill to produce the same amount of energy that it took to build the windmill is about 9 or 10 months. So in order to build a second windmill, it would be another 9 or 10 months. So that's an important thing, because sometimes I do hear people saying that about windmills, and in my research, it's not true. But I will say that it doesn't mean that wind or solar is a good idea. And I think if you look at the idea of increasing energy flux density, the energy flux density of wind and solar is fixed. And I'm actually giving a preview here of part 2 because I'm planning to develop this further. But the amount of sun that hits a square meter of land, the amount of energy from the sun, is fixed. You can't ever increase it. So you don't increase your energy flux density ever by building solar panels and windmills. It's a fixed amount, and no amount of concentrating solar rays with mirrors or any of the other things they've tried to do increases it. And on top of that, it's a very low energy flux density. It's a very diffuse form of energy. Like there's a reason, for example, why we use water and steam in energy generation to turn turbines, or sometimes we use gas. But water and steam, the air is like 1/4 of the fluid pressure. I can't remember what the exact term is, but so water is able to impart 4 times as much force to turn something than the air is. So the air turning the wind turbine is an extremely diffuse form of energy, as is the amount of solar radiance on a given square meter of Earth, which I think the maximum, like in, you know, near the equator, is something like 2,000 watts per square meter at high noon. But really, you know, in California, it's like 12 or 1,500, and then up in Canada, it's like 800 watts. And that's in the summertime, right? Like, how much solar radiance are we getting right now in Canada? And as I always laugh when I hear people who want to be taken seriously on energy policy issues, and they're Canadians, and they talk about how we need more solar power in Canada. Like, you just immediately disqualified yourself because you showed you don't even have a basic comprehension of the issues involved. Like, you're advocating solar energy. First of all, it doesn't work 12 hours a day every day right off the bat, right? Because of nighttime. But on top of that, it doesn't work 4 to 6 months out of the year in you know, the highly inhabited parts of Canada, let alone, you know, the northern Arctic parts that we should be developing more. So that's what I have to say on that issue.
All right. I think I'll summarize. We had a comment from someone who I think is going to represent a significant grouping of people who may watch this lecture, which is the question of what is the use of development if we, as a species, they believe it's not really an issue of lack of development, but really a lack of self-restraint in terms of not just this like consumerist idea, but in terms of seeking power. So in their comment, they brought up power in, I think, a very general manner. And they view this increase in energy as an increase in power, which will be destructive and not really solving the issues that we are finding here on Earth. And and also there's just a huge, oh, that's someone else. Okay, sorry. And then another comment that I think kind of piggybacked on that was this idea that nuclear reactors aren't really feasible. Maybe if we have the development of robotics so that it can remove human error, it will be a possibility, but right now they're too dangerous. Just a note for everyone that there was a lecture given by Cuauhtemoc on the feasibility of nuclear energy as the second presentation to the symposium. But if you could also just address it here, Sam, for the audience that will be watching this on YouTube.
Yeah, so nuclear power is substantially and demonstrably the safest form of energy generation that we have on planet Earth, and that includes solar power and windmills. You can go online and find studies, you know, showing human casualties per terawatt hour of energy produced for each energy source. And last time I looked, solar energy kills about 10 times as many people per terawatt hour than nuclear power has throughout its history. So human error, yes, I mean, human error is largely removed already from nuclear power because we have triple redundancy and we have all kinds of control systems. But I would say I'm not a fan of the current pressurized water solid fuel reactor paradigm that we're in. And I would like to see us in fourth generation nuclear power development move towards high temperature, low pressure reactor designs. For example, molten salt reactor, molten lead reactors, reactors that use heat carriers which don't have to be pressurized, which just by their own natural characteristics can withstand very high temperatures. So the reason why we use water in nuclear reactors largely goes back to Hyman Rickover and the US Navy developing nuclear reactors for aircraft carriers for the Navy, which makes sense. They're at sea, so they have access to water easily. So it made sense for them to choose water as the medium. But the problem with water is that water boils at 100 degrees. And 100 degrees is not nearly hot enough for useful industrial processes. So the minimum that you want for turning a turbine to generate electricity is about 330 degrees. And so in order to do that, you have to highly pressurize the water. So to about 90 atmospheres of pressure. So like 90 times the pressure that water is at in the general open atmosphere. And that introduces all of the dangers that we currently have in nuclear power, which, as I've said, are much less than every other energy source in terms of human fatalities. But still, like, for example, you have water under tremendous pressure. If you have a pipe shear or some other failure of the pressure vessel, this highly pressurized steam, which is radioactive, now escapes from the reactor and gets into the open environment unless you have a containment building, which we do, except at Chernobyl, as we all know. And these containment buildings are massive structures, very, very, very strong, reinforced steel, concrete. And the pressure vessels themselves for the nuclear reactors, I mean, it's very difficult to even make a new pressurized water reactor these days because you can't even get the pressure vessel that you need for the reactor because there's only one place in the world that can make one. It's called Japan Steelworks in Japan. And because you can't have any welds in a pressure vessel where you're at 90 atmospheres of pressure because the welds will be a point of failure. So you need to have like the pressure vessels in a nuclear reactor are enormous. They're, like 5 stories tall or something like that. These are enormous pieces of steel, and they need to be all cast as a single piece. So there's not many foundries in the world. There's only one actually that can do it. So by moving to low pressure, high temperature, 4th generation reactors, what you get is much higher degrees of safety and much lower cost because you don't have high pressure forcing out radioactive materials into the open environment like you do with pressurized steam. So even if you have a rupture in the vessel, which is unlikely, it has no pressure behind it. So it just kind of like spills out onto the floor. And so the containment building becomes much less expensive. And the vessel itself becomes much less expensive because you don't have to have foot thick steel that's solid cast as a single piece. You can now use rolled steel, sheet metal, like much, much easier manufacturing processes. So that's what I hope to see in the development of nuclear power going forward is this move towards high temperature, low pressure, much higher safety and lower cost. So in terms of the first question that he said, I'm trying to understand, it seems kind of like a depressing view of man that everything is power relations and, there is no agape, there is no love of humanity, there is no desire to improve human society. So I'm struggling with how to answer this question because I don't understand the point of view that it's coming from.
Yeah, and I mean, he's not on the call right now. And he was, I don't know if you were there last week, Sam. He was the one that was talking about how AI is going to be the future ultimately, because humans are just too irresponsible and selfish. But I would say I'm going to say something, and then maybe you can also add to it. Is that this concept of I think they're both tied together. Either people who say like, why go to space when people are starving? There's wars going on and all of this. Like, why are we focusing on something that doesn't really seem to have any positive contribution to society here on Earth. And then there's the other argument, and I think that they're both, you know, tied, they're related, which is you can't have cooperation, you can't have responsible economic development until you deal with the issues of war. And the thing is that you deal with issues of war, or even, like, for instance, terrorism. These are economic issues. And if you can develop your economy with positive attributes so that it can build, so that the people are not living in a desperate situation, which is definitely what is behind the recruitment of terrorism. If people had access to a decent way of life and had access to a future where their education system, they were going into school to learn because they actually had an idea of a beautiful future, instead of just a job to make money, to make ends meet, to live day by day kind of way of living. Solving these things is what is going to solve the issues of war, of terrorism. And it's also going to solve the issues of hunger and famine and water shortage and disease and these sorts of things as well, because it's creating the solutions for those. So we have to kind of get out of this negative idea of humankind, because we are living right now in a situation where we are seeing a lot of the dark side of humanity. But if we were to actually provide and not treat humans as animals, you could see very quickly a very different side of humanity. We just need the leadership for it. The people in general, the masses will adapt very quickly once there is a viable future that's shaped for them. So you can never solve war and scarcity by, like, just addressing them in a direct linear fashion. You have to get out of the box, and you have to develop solutions that are going to raise the society to positive directionalities. And that's how you're going to get away from that.
Yeah, I completely agree. It sort of goes back to the last quote at the end about not fighting the old, but building the new. That you have to put forward the positive solutions. There is no way, like you said, to attack it directly. The only way to attack it is to build the new mode of being, which makes the old way obsolete. And I will say, you know, we have talked a lot about oligarchism, about oligarchical control of society, and it's increasing, I think. And this degraded view of man, there's billions of dollars spent every year in promoting this view, precisely so that this system can continue. Like, you can't have all of these wars degrading all of these societies around the world unless you have a public relations effort which is driving into people's heads that there is no other solution, there is no other way of life. And so I agree with you also that, like, I disagree with people when they say, you know, why go to space? We have so many problems here on Earth. It's the point is just like going to the moon. There were a myriad of technologies that were invented in order to get us to the moon. You know, from like computers to like medical advances, like material sciences, that then came home to Earth, that we then applied to the problems of humanity here on Earth. And so, like, if we're talking about going into space, you know, fusion, rocketry, whatever, advances that are made can be then brought back to Earth as well to help solve problems of humanity here on Earth. But the question is, where do you want to devote your resources? Do you want to take your money and spend it on military industrial complex? Or do you want to spend it on Project Artemis? Do you want to spend it on, you know, joining the Belt and Road Initiative and developing infrastructure for the good of humanity?
Hmm.
You know, like
No.
billions of dollars on war doesn't get humanity very much. Billions of dollars on, you know, medical infrastructure after COVID, or, you know, fusion power, or a base on the moon, or whatever. And hint, hint, this is all coming in part two. It's a much better use of your resources. That really the world we're living in now is one of an utter waste of human and material resources. That's just tragic in nature. And it's
Yeah.
just,
Oh, sorry.
yes, no, go on.
It's not even the choice of the people, you know, like it's not humanity. It's there is a certain unfair you know, harboring of power and wealth right now. And it's not the choice of the people to go in these directions, to have war and so forth. And war is actually the biggest robbing of people, because it creates an economic stimulus, but without any real qualitative return to the people. So you can have like certain aspects of like illusion of wealth and value and progress in certain sectors of the society, because a military industrial program will also create, you know, certain science driver programs, but it's ultimately negative, and it's ultimately not going to be shared with all of the people. It's going to create sectors, economic sectors, and further divisions of wealth within that society. So most definitely a space program is for the people, really for the people, and fusion power as well. Magdalene, did you want to share your story? And then after that, I think Gabe had some thoughts on something as well.
Actually, two things. So first of all, I'm reading this book with my grade 3 students. They're 9 years old, right? So it's trying to get some concepts across. The idea of how innovations help increase the living standards of people. And they're quite taken by that. So this is the story of a boy in Africa who basically built a windmill for his village. Obviously, we would advocate nuclear power, but I'm using this example for the kids to get the idea that innovations can make life better for people. Then on the other hand, I got a student in my class. He's again 9 years old, and he's an absolute fanatic of the space program. He all made us watch the landing of Perseverance on Mars the other day, and so we were discussing taking care of our planet and, you know, be responsible and so forth. And he says, well, actually, well, okay, well, if we all go to Moon and to Mars and further on, we don't have to care about Mother Earth anymore. We can just go on to new planets and take care of those and cultivate them and so forth. So, and then of course we had to step in and say, well, no, not quite, Andrew. We don't want to give up our old planet, but you're right. We should be fighting for cultivating other planets. So it's these ideas do percolate in children's minds. It's just a matter of you know, you have to address them and steer them in the right direction.
I think Andrew is very forward thinking, and it could well be in 1,000 years that we've you know, landed on 6 super Earths, and yeah, we don't quite need the Earth as much anymore, but I think we're going to need the Earth still for a long time. But the idea that we can get resources in space in abundance, in many cases, you know, far more abundantly than we have here on Earth, leads to the issue that by getting them in space, we may lessen our impact on the Earth, especially in terms of mining. The same is true of fusion energy. I mean, even fission, even nuclear fission, you're moving to a qualitatively cleaner and lower impact on the environment, because as we saw from the energy density, for example, you need to mine a lot less to get the same amount of energy from a source of fuel. But fusion, I mean, we would have unlimited cheap energy with almost no pollution at all, and the fuel source is seawater. You know, so our mines would be boats taking seawater and putting them in barrels and bringing them back for processing, and that would be our impact on the Earth for energy generation for the entire planet. I mean, so these qualitative shifts in discovering new physical principles can help us to lessen our impact on the Earth and become better stewards of the Earth. And I think this goes back to Genesis 1:28, is that we aren't just supposed to subdue the Earth, we're supposed to replenish it as well. So like, we are supposed to be good stewards of the Earth. And so in order for us to get to this point now, we've had to develop things like coal power and oil and internal combustion engine, which are polluting and which do, you know, we used to have lead gasoline, you know. But did we have to do those quote unquote dirty things to progress to a certain point where we could finally not do them anymore? Because it allows us to move to higher levels of technological progress where we're polluting less and mining less and mining off Earth. So we don't even have mines on Earth anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And what you were saying about technological progress improving people's lives, it's really beaten out of people's heads now, especially due to environmentalism. And I used to be a rabid environmentalist before I met Matt. Thank you, Matt, by the way. So I know better than almost anyone. Like when I saw that animation that I put in my post for the first time in 1932, where they show railroad development and population density increasing, as an environmentalist, you're aghast, you know, and you say, this is awful. We're industrial development, building railroads, increasing the number of people. Like, you're taught as an environmentalist that back in the day when you had no technology and low population density, that was the life. You know, when you had no science and you shit in a hole in the ground, you know, that was the good life. You know, that's the entirety of environmentalist thinking, and it's really what needs to be overcome.
My grade 3s definitely do not agree with that was the life.
I saw a presentation once, a guy who was pro-nuclear, and he was like, you know, the kings in Europe 300 years ago, where did he get his food? Where did he go to the bathroom? When he got sick, what did the doctor do? What medical, you know? So like, homeless people on the streets of Los Angeles today have a better life than kings of Europe did 300 years ago.
That's romanticism, right? Back to nature.
Back to nature, yeah.
There- You can live 20 years if you're lucky.
Cynthia, are there any other questions?
Oh,
I can't see the
Gabe,
chats.
Gabe, if you're on, I know that you wrote a very thoughtful comment. If you wanted to share it.
Hi, do you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. Hi, Gabe.
Cool. Hi, Sam. First of all, I want to say that was a great presentation. Thank you very much. I mean, I just crammed a lot in the same comment there, so I won't address everything. I just wanted to just put an opinion out there. But the two things I want to mention first is about the last exchange you had with Cynthia there. I thought it was great, and I kind of agree with you as well. And the question of the system, right? So it related back to the epigenetics comment that Sam made, I think, earlier in the presentation, for example, because what they did in the scientific world, of course, they induced negative or traumatic experiences in animals, and they were able to trace them down epigenetically through, I think, 14 generations of like a worm or something like that. But you could probably do the same thing in a positive way, right? So you can like create a positive environment into which epigenetic changes will be able to be felt multi-generationally downwards as well. So if we create a scientific experiment or a new system that would induce positive situations for people or human beings, then the epigenetics will probably as well have a role to play downwards, I think, causally, as a cause and effect into showing the better angels of our nature, or whatever you want to call that, as a more general social way to just live as human beings. And so that was just a comment that popped into my head. And what I was saying is just, I think your conclusion was very well placed. The angle I wanted to bring, maybe that can be reflected about, is if we do like the double derivative that you said, right? So you, of course, if you do the calculus, then you get the area, and then the volume, right, or the acceleration, and then accelerating the acceleration, depending on how you view calculus and the derivative. But then at one point, once you do that, if you use calculus or like at one point you can't derive anymore, right? So you cannot see, I think, linearly the objective over a long term, right? You have to see it as going through steps or levels, or what I coined quantas, right? Because at one point, the more acceleration you get, then the sharper your slopes get, and then it's going to become an asymptote, right? And an asymptote at one point, it closes the gap, or it's going to fall back on itself. So it is going to create a quanta, right? If you see it geometrically. So the development, or even the energy flux density, is probably going to respect that law. So that's what we're going to be aiming for, I think, that your conclusion. But we have to be realistic that in the natural way of things, it's not going to increase in that way indefinitely. At one point, the asymptote is going to create a natural barrier, and we're going to reach a new equilibrium, a new balance. And then how do we transition from that to the next step? It's going to be the real, probably deeper question. And I was just saying that probably right now, that's what we're going through, right? We reached the end of the second, or whatever, third industrial revolution. So we reached the end of that second quanta, and we're going through another one, and we're trying to do it as consciously as possible. So that was just my comment. Thank you. It was great.
Thank you. If I understand you correctly, so you're saying that, yeah, so the derivative, meaning the rate of change, so it's not enough for our potential relative population density to be increasing. What I was saying, that you need the rate of increase to be increasing every year. And that is an anti-entropic society. And so you're saying that with the rate, the double derivative, that eventually you're going to a rate of change that becomes vertical, is what you're saying, right?
Right.
So I
get with I would say with anything, right? It's the same. It's the same with anything. If you, well, it depends on your view of the whole universe, but exactly. And so at that point, then. Well, I'm just going to let you finish your thoughts. Sorry.
So my thoughts on that are that if we were confined to a closed system, meaning that we were confined to Earth, that yes, I would agree with you, that there is a necessary upper limit to human population density above which we could never surpass. But I think because we are not limited to Earth, that is the nature of anti-entropic growth that we're going to see in humanity going forward. So I've had this conversation before. I am an engineer. When I went to engineering school, we were forced to take classes on renewable energy, on green ideology, with which I vehemently disagreed. And I was very vocal in class because they would, bring up the same environmentalist tropes that we live on a planet of fixed resources, and we're using up those resources and not returning them. And so eventually we're going to run out of resources.
Right. And just, I don't want to interrupt you, but that's not what I'm saying, because what I'm saying is it's not like that the vertical is the end. It's just a big, actually the vertical doesn't exist, right? It's actually transverse.
Yes.
It's just an illusion, right? So what I'm saying is just that it's the end of that particular increase or rate of double acceleration, as you put it. Not that it's totally the end. It's just one quanta. What I'm just calling it a quanta, for example. But you can get to another one, right? But there's going to be a transition needed, another step, right? So I'm not saying, actually, I'm not defending entropy. What I'm advocating for is that it's actually anti-entropic, but it's quantized. So the anti-entropy cannot go linear. It has to be quantized as well, because it's like a vortex. It's flipping back on itself. And before it flips back on itself, then our responsibility is to advocate a proper transition to the next phase. I don't know if it can be understood, or I don't know if I'm being clear. I've never vocalized that before, so it's like a thought that I'm trying to form, but I don't know if you get it.
So no, I do get it. But so what if the rate of growth was something parabolic akin to a cubic function? Because we know that the derivative of a cubic function is a square, like x squared. It's proportional to x squared, and then the double derivative would be proportional to x. And so the double derivative itself is always increasing as x increases, but you don't ever go on a x cubed graph. You don't ever go vertical.
Right. I'm actually not a mathematician, and I think that would need to be developed into a more fully dialogue. But I just think like every function is just a different section or cross section of the quanta, right? But it depends on if you look at it through vectors or through curves. And this is what the different functions on a graph are. So all of them have a particular point of view through the whole quanta. So I would have to see it visually. I'm more of a visual person. I'm not a mathematician, so I don't have them like inside my head right now. So I would be happy to talk about it, but I can't answer that specific question without like seeing it myself. So I'm sorry.
Could I make a question? I mean, a point on this?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
I'm gonna put my email in the chat, Gabe. And why don't we continue this by email?
Okay, so one thing I wanted to say about this issue is the redefining of what resources are is very important. In terms of I think you might be talking about like a step function where that happens. When you move from one resource to the other, you no longer, if you're in a new resource base, what you're essentially doing is redefining the function itself. It's a new function. And one of the things about the fusion energy is this concept of fusion torch. So that you can refine, if you have a fusion torch principle, you can refine all of the elements out of that are very, those in the crust of the earth, they're all there. But you don't have the energy that you would have with plasma fusion torch to actually refine those things. But as you move to a new step, a new technology, you can redefine the resource base in that way. And I think it's kind of like a quantum change in terms of what you define as resource bases. You can still use the previous resources in the old, we still burn wood, right? But at the same time that we can still have a wood burning stove or whatever, right? We're using a much higher density, a step function of ahead with nuclear fission than we are with we could ever attain with burning wood through the energy density throughput to our economy. And, so that as far as this asymptotic question, it's if you look at it at resources, as not being fixed, but constantly being redefined by new technologies. And I agree, space is going to provide us a whole, I mean, there's obviously, if we're going to space, there's no issue with any physical limits of resources, because space is virtually unlimited as far as the human species is concerned, ever will be.
I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Curtis. I saw you in the chat. You said you
Yeah,
wanted to.
so I wanted okay, so this situation with Thomas Malthus and Darwin, there were 3 political economists, one in the 1870s, one in the 1890s, and another one in the 1890s, who either refuted Darwin or refuted both of them. One was his name was Francis Bowen, and he wrote a small pamphlet called Malthusianism, Darwinism, and Pessimism. Then there was George Gunton, an English-American political economist, and he refuted Darwin by linking Darwin's political thought or economic thought to laissez-faire. And he was promoting artificial selection instead of random selection. Whatever term Darwin called it. George B. Curtis refuted Malthus and Darwin, stated that Darwin got his ideas from Malthus, and he turned the whole Darwin and Malthus question into a question of what does man want to do next century, right? And Curtis was saying, he said this, right? He said the question at the beginning of the 19th century with a certain school of theoretical writers was how to prevent the increase in population. That's Malthus and Darwin.
Right.
While at the close of the same century, the question is, how can man be distributed over the earth? How can the natural resources and richness of the world best be utilized and developed? How can he most surely be provided with the means of employment through which most surely be purchased the necessaries and comforts of life? That the world is large enough and its resources sufficient, if properly utilized, to furnish an abundance for all. There cannot be the slightest question. This principle has been fully recognized by the school of protectionists, which seek to elevate the masses of humanity to dignify labor and to provide for the wants and necessities of life by the opening of mines, the building of factories, the cultivation of the soil, diversifying industries, and all of those means by which nature is made to give up her treasures in response to the industry of man, right? So George B. Curtis made this a political issue, a view of man, an economic issue, and also a cultural one, right? And I see that throughout your presentation, Sam, you made Darwin into a scientific problem, a political problem, and an economic problem. And I want to give you tremendous praise for doing that.
Oh, thank you, Curtis. I really appreciated the reading that you just did there, and I just Googled all 3 of the guys that you just mentioned, and I'm looking forward to looking into them more because I haven't yet.
Yeah.
And please, if you can I know we're friends on Facebook, so if you can message me any book titles.
What's I have so many friends on Facebook, I can't keep track. I
'Cause
didn't even know I was your friend on Facebook.
You're in California, right?
No, I'm in Maryland.
Oh, Maryland. Okay. So
can you write your email again in the chat?
Absolutely. Oh, I sent it to Matt again.
Yeah, Curtis has compiled a very interesting list of some underappreciated British political economists who broke with the Malthusian dismal science angle and resonated a lot more with the American system of Hamilton and that spirit. So I'm sure.
Well, I've always enjoyed your posts, Curtis, because I know you post a lot about your Henry C. Carey reading groups, and you post a lot about, and I love Henry Carey, so I always love reading your posts. So I look forward to other authors that you could introduce as well.
Yeah, I'll do that for you. I'll do that for you, Sam.
Cool. Well, we're rounding up the third hour right now, and this was a really stimulating afternoon. I really, from the bottom of my heart, Sam, this was an extraordinary presentation. I thank you enormously for having offered this to everyone.
Thanks for the opportunity, Matt.
And
Cynthia.
We're going to have a lot of the reference material that you cited from Vernadsky, from Hamilton, in the description box to this video on YouTube, so people can go into that. And I think that as we finish the Mike Billington paper over the coming 2 weeks that we're reading on Wednesdays, I think reading some of the essential material from LaRouche to sort of get into the mind of the science of physical economy in more depth is going to be very high up on that reading list, and maybe some Vernadsky as well. So thank you again for putting the focus on all of these things. Just to make a general announcement, next week we'll have Jonathan Tenenbaum debunking some of the lies and myths of artificial intelligence. So I think from Cynthia's presentation on Leibniz versus Clarke and the clash of these different paradigms of a mechanical universe and a mechanical God and a mechanical man made in the image of that mechanical entropic God, versus a living universe, a living creator, a living species of man made in the image of that creator, all the way to Quau's class on space and the atom, to Dave's class on Kusa, and now this wonderful class. I think this is going to be a really nice organic flow, a very anti-entropic flow of ideas. And it'll be at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, though. So for people in Europe, it's mostly going to be 8 p.m. So keep that in mind. It's going to be 2 hours earlier. And I hope to see everyone there.